What's up, everybody? It's Tuesday, and that means a whole lot of NBA discussion on the way here on the Slate. Great to be back with you here. Adam Kaufman was with you this morning for the sweat. Hopefully you tuned in for that. And if you did, you didn't only see me. You saw Matt Meiselman, who is back with us talking hoops, just as he did earlier today. And, of course, Chirag Hira, he is on this program every Tuesday. And, boys, we got a busy one. That's not always the case on a Tuesday in the NBA. We have got a 9-game slate, and not just that. As we sit here a little less than now 2 hours away from lock, there's a lot of injury news still to be determined, still to be announced that will impact your bets, your lineup building for DFS, all of it. So, Matt, let's start with you. What's number one, number two in terms of what you're keeping an eye on still?
So it's a different answer for betting and for DFS. I think it's a very different answer for both. Fred VanVleet, for betting purposes, I've kind of been harping on this for maybe a month or two now. Fred VanVleet is a top 10 player in the NBA. Like, I'm pretty confident in that. And he's really the main thing that drives the Raptors' success. If he doesn't play, I think the Hornets might even be favored on the road in Toronto. So that's a really big deal for betting purposes. For DFS, I mean, the Raptors have enough guys with high usage rates that can kind of pick up the slack for him. So I'm not sure if there's any one thing that's going to make a huge impact for DFS that we're still waiting on. Obviously, we have this Pelicans situation. So we're going to have to talk about that team. They're missing just about everybody tonight. But yeah, in terms of what we're still waiting on, it's Fred VanVleet, it's De'Aaron Fox, potentially Patrick Beverley, but those I think are a little more betting relevant. And the DFS value is really like it's all coming from New Orleans right now.
We'll definitely do some deep dives because, heck, we got you for the better part of an hour. We can go game by game and hit on a little bit of everything if we want to, in addition to, of course, the betting trends and, of course, DFS. But, Chirag, same question for you, my friend. What are you watching for right now?
Trying to figure out, honestly, what's the best way to build for this slate. If everybody's going to be jamming in all these Pelicans and they're extremely cheap, does that mean that it's going to be a stars and scrubs type of night? Because you have Jose Alvarado at 3,100. You have Jackson Hayes at 3,100. Hernan Gomez, 4,700. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 3,700. So these are the top 4 guys that are likely to garner ownership in tonight's slate. And if this was a normal slate that we do on Tuesdays, 2 games, 3 games, 4 games, fine, stack it all the way up. But it gives me a little bit of pause because of this magnitude of the size of the slate. This is not a normal Tuesday night slate, and just stacking 3-4 guys can make sense. But if everyone's doing that in a single entry lineup, you have a chance to differentiate yourself because there are so many options.
I'm looking at it right now, guys. And in terms of, we all have our different places that we look, obviously, for point projections, ownership, everything else. And we can get into all the point projections and the best plays in terms of returning value. But ownership wise right now, and of course, a lot can change between now and lock, even after lock, before certain games lock as the evening goes along, because again, 9 games, we're going to be playing basketball all night long. But top 4 guys in terms of ownership, they're all Pelicans right now. It's Alexander Walker, it's Alvarado, it's Hernan Gomez, and it's Hayes, owned anywhere from basically 25% of lineups all the way up to NAW, who is north of 50% of lineups. The question is, obviously, Chirag, I mean, do you do it? Do you trust it? Do you go with the chalk, basically, because you just believe, hey, everybody else is going to, or do you focus more on differentiation?
Well, the bigger thing is this news on De'Aaron Fox. That opens up a little bit. And then we also have the injury news on Fred VanVleet.
Well, here we go. VanVleet's not playing tonight. Sorry to cut you off, but there it is.
Okay.
There it is.
Things are going to start happening now.
So expect increased ownership for Pascal Siakam now. Continue.
But who's going – Fred VanVleet plays 40 minutes tonight over the last 10 games. That's just not somebody you can just plug and play and be like, oh, yeah, he's going to come in and be – I mean, Gary Trent's going to have to pick up the usage as a guard now. You're going to have to see possibly Scottie Barnes bringing it up more as well. Like, there's a sizable impact here. So, Matt started it off with Fred VanVleet. What's your go-to move there?
I don't really know yet. Like, I think we need to see a starting lineup, right? Like, I'm trying to think who's going to start here. We haven't had Van Vliet out for a game, right? Like all these other Raptors have missed time this year.
Yep.
I think Van Vliet's played a ton of games in a row. So Malachi Flynn, does he move up to the, like, they don't have Goran Dragic. The Raptors really don't play a lot of backup guards because, like you said, Van Vliet plays most of the game. And then they kind of stagger the minutes with Barnes and Trent such that like no one else that is in the backcourt really plays much off the bench.
Yep.
So yeah, maybe we get that. I don't know if we're going to get this starting lineup while we're still on this show, but whoever fills in as the starting, and I think it's basically the point guard, right? I think Van Vliet is the team's point guard really. So yeah, whoever that guy is, I mean, it's going to be Flynn or Banton, right? Like those are the two choices.
Yep.
Well, what about Scottie Barnes?
He's already starting.
Could they play a bigger
I just
lineup?
mean, yeah. Could they shift the lineup around a little bit and put him at point guard instead of small forward?
Yeah, and then you get Precious Achiuwa playing center, Siakam down to the 4 because Siakam's been starting at center. Yeah, I mean that's certainly possible. Barnes is really interesting, I think, right now, especially if he's playing, if he's functionally the point guard, even though he's not really much of a point guard.
Yeah, it's one of the many things, obviously, that we'll be keeping an eye on here as we're with you until almost 6 o'clock Eastern time. And some other additional news. We have Matisse Thiebel for the Sixers just announced he is going to play despite that shoulder injury. So that is one less question mark, not a significant one, obviously, on the level of Fred VanVleet or even some of the other question marks that we're waiting on, the likes of obviously Anthony Davis and so many others. Looking at this, I mean, let's zero in because we're already 20 minutes practically into the show. Let's zero in on that New Orleans game that Matt, you brought up before, because this is
I just want to make a quick note here. Yeah. If Flynn does start, the chances of people trying to jam in 2 or 3 superstars in this slate is exponentially higher now because he's 3K. You get all these other 3K guys from New Orleans. You're going to see there's so many studs to play up on the slate. Brooklyn's at home, so that's the Harden spot. Like you have a lot of
Irving, obviously.
So I think that there's a lot to question here now if Flynn does start. So I just wanted to notice that before we go into
that's fine. Let's keep building on that, and we'll save the Pelicans. We got plenty of time for them. So all guys that are north of 10K tonight, and there are a bunch, like you said, Shrug. Nick Jokic, James Harden, LeBron James, obviously we expect to see out there. Joel Embiid, DeJounte Murray, who's going to be probably pretty chalky tonight. We were, just fawning all over him this morning during the sweat. You've got Luka Doncic, obviously, Jason Tatum, who's coming off the 51-point game. Karl Anthony Towns, Steph Curry, or Towns is 9,400, but still he's in the mix among the studs, obviously. Curry, Pascal Siakam, who as mentioned is just sub 9K, but is in a prime spot. You have a lot of different studs you could go to if you are picking just a couple, because you have so much value elsewhere between the aforementioned Pelicans and if Flynn starts and some of these Spurs guys that are available. Obviously, if you're sandwiching in 2 true studs, maybe even 3 that are say 9K or above, who are you going to go with?
I'm honestly leaning towards Harden. Just the way the Lakers have not been playing great defensively, and they got to stay in this matchup. But also, Luka Doncic, he has been on a significant tear lately. And yeah, the Warriors are a solid defensive team, but without Draymond Green in there, I think those are the 2 guys that they give you triple-double upside, and that gives you the bonus potential.
What do you think, Matt?
So this is a tough call, and I think positionality is going to make a big deal here because like the 2 highest owned centers, it looks like, are both Pelicans. They're both cheap, which means we have to see less ownership going to the expensive centers. I do like Luka Doncic. I think Harden makes a lot of sense, although Harden might be the chalkiest of the group. DeJounte Murray, like LeBron, I mean, all these guys seem pretty similar, but if you want to fade the New Orleans centers, I mean, Embiid could knock them both out of the game for foul trouble, right? Like that's a real possibility. So you could play Jokic, you could play Embiid, although I'm definitely concerned about a blowout there. And I actually do think Matisse Thiebel matters a lot here. The Sixers are pretty shorthanded on the wing. Seth Curry's out, Danny Green's out. If you had Thiebel out too, that would mean Charlie Brown and Furkan Korkmaz and Georges Niang playing a lot of minutes. Thiebel's a much, much better defender than those guys. So I think it's going to make life a lot more difficult for the Pelicans that we're worried about rostering, and also more of a chance the game is a blowout. But then we have Karl Anthony Towns and Yusuf Nurkic and Christian Wood. Like, there's a lot of centers. So to me, like, it seems viable to pay up for 2 centers and save salary elsewhere, not because you're just actively fading Hayes and Hernangomez, but there's so many good centers to choose from. So I think ultimately I want to play one Pelican center and one of these pay-ups. Because the other thing that's relevant too is that a couple of these chalky players negatively correlate with each other, where if you have both in a lineup in a GPP, the odds of getting a ceiling game out of both Hayes and Hernangomez, where they're both like splitting the game, I mean, that's going to be a pretty narrow thing to go for. It's a pretty narrow outcome to play for. And to a lesser extent, I think that's kind of true with Alvarado and Alexander Walker. I mean, the closer the game is, the more Alexander Walker plays and the less Alvarado potentially plays. And if we get a blowout, I think Alexander Walker's not playing garbage time. Alvarado almost certainly would play garbage time. So those two negatively correlate in some sense. They're kind of the same position. I would assume they both start, but one having a great game is going to take away from the other potentially having a great game. So to me, it seems like the right amount of Pelicans to play is 2 guys. You pick 1 point guard, you pick 1 center, and then maybe you play 2 studs, 1 at each position, because you probably want one of Luka, Harden, and DeJounte Murray in your lineup, and you probably want one of Embiid, Jokic, Towns, Nurkic. Like, there's a lot of good centers to choose from too.
I guess, Shirag, my overarching thought after, obviously hearing Matt talking all about the various Pelicans, and for anyone that hasn't been paying attention or hasn't been watching things today, we're not kidding when we say basically everyone who is, integral to that team's success is not playing tonight. Valanciunas is out. Ingram is out. Graham is out. Hart is out. Like, none of these guys who are, we're used to seeing out there starting are not going to play for New Orleans tonight, going up against a Sixers team that it's not great, obviously, but it's a good team. It's a team that's won 7 of 10. I know the Pelicans won their last couple, but certainly the Sixers to me are a superior team. What is this going to look like? Is there any chemistry out there on the floor? Is this a blowout waiting to happen? In which case you need to just wonder what garbage time is going to be available to you?
Well, the thing that I want to note too is that Herbert Jones has been playing over 30 minutes, and he's been playing, and with Valanciunas in there as well. Herbert can, if there's foul trouble or something to be had here, he could easily slide down and man up a little bit against Embiid. Sure, he's more of a kind of wingy, rangy player, but like, there's a chance here where, as Matt mentioned it, Jackson Hayes is not a lock for 35 minutes. I could maybe say he's a lock for 20, but like, is he going to play more than 25 minutes? The most minutes that Hernangomez has played this year is 32, and that was one instance. He doesn't have any other games this season over 24 minutes. Like, are they just going to magically run him out? Sure, it's a possibility, but you have the lean towards Hernangomez due to the minutes, but then there's the salary. You're not saving as much, 4,700 versus 3,100, and their range of outcomes could be very similar within 5 or 8 points. So it's like, that's another factor to keep into is Herbert Jones, if they were going to run him at all at center or as kind of a double helper on Hayes and Hernangomez.
Anybody has any questions, thoughts, comments, whatever, get them in. Obviously, we're here with you for about another half hour, and we haven't even really started to go game by game, just sort of talking about overarching thoughts on this slate, good key players, guys you want to take advantage of, especially with regard to daily fantasy and chasing big money tonight, available to you in the lobby, obviously over at DraftKings, but not just that, responding to key breaking news as we get it. It would seem to make sense, though. Let's get into Sportsbook and what things look like tonight. Obviously, you've got some games that we're looking for a whole lot of points. San Antonio and Houston. I'm not so sure this won't be a lopsided game, but 233 is the over-under, 233.5 for Minnesota and Portland. I think what makes these games really interesting, obviously, is they're a little bit later than the others. That's, something people are going to have to consider when setting their fantasy lineups, clearly before lock ahead of 7 o'clock Eastern time. But Matt, in terms of, which game from a sports betting perspective, you're more inclined to want to target and go after, whether you like the spread, the point total, certain props, whatever it may be. What do you like?
So the reason I'm looking over here is because we just got a whole bunch more news.
Okay.
So let's do this first.
Yeah, let's dance
Hayward's
around.
out. Gordon Hayward is out. He was questionable, so I don't think that's an especially big deal. And I think that the Hornets are deep enough on the wing that that's not going to affect the spread. I do really like the Hornets. If you're someone who was following when Van Vliet got ruled out and bet them then, Van Vliet's really, really good. Like the Hornets, I think, are going to be favored now, but I'm not worried about Hayward. I don't think that matters. We just got Marcus Morris ruled out also for personal reasons. That was totally unexpected. So I'm looking now. I think Terrence Mann is the guy who hasn't been starting, who likely will start now because they've been starting Batum and Amir Coffey.
Yep.
And Zubac, Jackson. Has Mann been? Maybe Mann's been in the starting lineup. All these guys are going to get more minutes, though. I think the Clippers.
Mann did start a chunk in basically all of December and the first week of January. That was his like push of starting. So he has recorded.
He hasn't recently. Right, Morris is the starter though. Recently, correct. Mann started for a while. Now it's been Morris with Batum, Coffey, Zubac, and Jackson. But Mann likely, as you're saying, will take Morris's spot. So
also we have the Sixers starters, so we're able to answer that question at this point.
We have Thiebel in the starting lineup.
The Raptor starters. I thought we had the Sixers, the Raptor starters with
yes,
and Bleet out. So we have it's going to be Trent Jr., Anunoby, Barnes, Siakam, Achua.
Yep. Okay, so Trent and Barnes, I think all the players there got better because now there's more ball handling responsibility. I mean, I guess the rebounding potential goes down for everyone, but the ball handling potential goes up because if you had Flynn or Batten in the starting lineup, those are obviously guards, like more so than Achua, who's going to play center. I mean, Gary Trent has to play more minutes now. I don't know if he's like going to, I think Siakam really is the point guard here, right? Like who's doing the primary ball handling for this game?
Trent's a decent ball handler, but yeah, in the half court, probably you'll have Siakam working the majority of it. And he has the most upside on this team in terms of points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks. Like, he has the most upside.
Yeah, I mean, his betting lines for prop betting are pretty high already. He was at like 40.5 points, rebounds, and assists. So I don't really think that there's much value. Like the guys who are going to look the best for prop betting, if their lines are still up, which they may not be, but whatever. I think it's Barnes and Trent who just get a larger bump, right? Like Siakam definitely has the largest ceiling on the team, but I think that it was kind of accounted for already to a larger extent, whereas Barnes and Trent get bigger increases as a result of Van Vliet being out. And then obviously Achua now starting. I mean, it's just clouding. It's even more like chaos for the center position where there's just so many guys you can pick there. Maybe for betting, we should focus on games that don't have news going on because it's just like, it's so hard to read these situations. And I still feel pretty confident though, that looking at this Hornets Raptors line with the Raptors -1, the Hornets will wind up favored. I feel like pretty good about that. It might take some time for the line to adjust accordingly, but I think we see the Hornets get to like -1.5. So I guess I'm saying I still think there's a little bit of value there betting the Hornets, even money to win. I think they probably wind up winning the game. Yeah, and there it goes, -110.
Yeah, and no props currently listed. Obviously, all of that needs to be worked out in terms of the players at this moment. So as we continue to do the dance, watch for breaking news and respond accordingly, obviously. Which game are you keying in on here, Sharad?
I mean, from a personal standpoint,
it's all about the Lakers.
I really, really am looking forward to Anthony Davis getting back in the mix, and that's going to be something key here. The Nets are not exactly an elite defensive team, so that's something that's a big deal here. But this Mavs Warriors game just speaks to me in terms of like, I don't understand why the total is at 210.5. It doesn't make sense to me, but from a betting perspective, like, and using that towards fantasy, there has to be something to gain from the Spurs Rockets game.
This obviously the Warriors and Mavericks that you mentioned, one of the things we're waiting on is to find out whether Klay Thompson is available for this game. Something we were talking about in our internal Slack before the show. You guys were kind of going back and forth on the key injuries to watch for, and which guys you were almost kind of, which teams should be hoping that their star players are unavailable because, quite frankly, at this point, they're not necessarily as good without them. And Matt, you were talking about Klay Thompson a little bit and what this team looks like with Klay versus without him. And it's not, hey, it's a better team without Klay Thompson. They have a better chance of winning a championship without him or anything like that. We're just talking in the here and now, in the moment, as this is a team that's sort of trying to figure out its identity, what it is after an incredibly hot start, now trying to mix in a star player who hasn't played in a couple of years. And he's obviously and understandably been a bit rusty. Is it beneficial if he is not on the court tonight?
I think it's interesting you mentioned championship there, because I think that Klay Thompson does make the Warriors worse right now, but him being there increases their chances of winning the championship because there's a higher ceiling. Like, I don't think Klay is playing that great yet, but there's definitely a shot for him to get back to his old self and play the way that he was 3 years ago. And I don't really think the Warriors are winning the championship without that happening. Like, I think that there are just other teams in the Western Conference, probably both conferences, but they're like the Suns and Jazz at full strength, I think, are just better. But for tonight's game, more importantly for people watching, Klay, I think if Klay is in, it's going to move the spread towards the Warriors. And I don't think it should. Like, at that point, you're going to get Mavs at +4, +4.5, because the main reason that I don't think Klay helps the team, it doesn't have much to do with Klay himself, who I think is fine. It's because Gary Payton II plays less minutes when Klay is there. And I think he's like, if the sixth man of the year went to the best bench player in the league, he'd win it. Like, he is really, really good. He just doesn't get the counting stats. He's a defense first player. He's really like a defense only player, but he's unbelievably good at defense. So if I like the Mavericks tonight, which I'm leaning that direction, I want Klay to play. I want Peyton to play less, and I want to get more points on the spread. I want to be able to bet the Mavs at +4 or higher, which I think we'll be able to do. Unfortunately, this went the other way the other night where the Jazz were playing the Warriors, and I liked Utah it was like +5, 5.5 with Rudy Gobert in. The problem is that Klay got announced out before they gave the Gobert announcement, and the line had already moved down to 4 by the time Gobert was in. And so you were getting less points, and it was a worse bet because, having Klay out actually is worse for the Jazz in that scenario. I know it's it's going to be highly contentious to say that because Klay Thompson, when he's on, is like as good as anybody, but I still feel it's true just because like the Warriors have a ton of depth. They can make up for him not being there to a very large extent. And it's not like they don't have scorers. They have Jordan Poole. They obviously have Steph Curry. They have Andrew Wiggins. Like, Otto Porter Jr. is good. There's plenty of guys who can play on this team.
You didn't even mention your favorite player, bro. Come on.
Oh, Nemanja Bjelica, of course. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Nemanja, if you're listening. I'm going to stop there though, because Will Barton just got ruled out.
All right. Well, let's keep going around, obviously. So that's, one of the things that we were watching for in terms of obviously what was going to happen with Denver tonight. So you take a look at the Nuggets. Barton is out. Jeff Green is still a game time decision as far as at least what we last looked at.
How do you even fade Nikola Jokic at all now? Like, he has to drop a triple double.
Well, it's the guy going for, he's averaging 60 plus fantasy points.
Yeah, like it's so difficult to even consider what their entire, basically all their offensive strength is now going to be. Is Nikola Jokic going to have 60 points, rebounds, and assists?
It's a relevant bump for Aaron Gordon too, but Jokic definitely, not having Barton there definitely helps him also.
Does that impact what I asked you guys earlier in terms of which couple of studs are you looking to lock into your lineup? Is it now Joker and whomever? Is Siakam, Murray, LeBron, Luka, wherever it is that you're looking?
I like to think I'm pretty savvy with following news and reacting quickly, but so much has changed in just
in the last 10 minutes
that I'm like, I think we're going to have to wait for the dust to settle to some extent before I can like really have a concrete answer there. But I still feel pretty good about the idea that paying up at center, where the Pelicans centers will be very popular. And I think paying up for one center, whether that means that you play Embiid now because Jokic is chalk because Barton's out, like that's a consideration. But I think the Blazers, it's so hard because we still have moving parts here. If Beverly doesn't play, like Beverly is the best defender on Minnesota. You take him out, the Blazers players look a decent amount better. You also get Jalen Noel at $4,100, who's roughly the same price as Beverly. Like, we don't even have everything yet. We still don't know if De'Aaron Fox is playing. So I definitely like Jokic, but I don't really know what I'm doing yet, if I'm being honest.
We got time to figure it out here. Like I said, here with you another 15, 20 minutes or so. What about you, Shirag? How are you, reacting on the fly in this moment?
I could just say it just makes too much sense to not build around Nikola Jokic now, but there's so much value because I really like Trent. I believe that there's going to be a large portion of it where he's going to just be the de facto guard in a close game. That there's so much value in this game that like I cannot ignore Nikola Jokic. Like now is just screaming off the top. Like it's so difficult to, his upside is unparalleled now. But the thing is, like Embiid too, where he's dominated so much. And as Matt mentioned, like he can literally go out and get these guys into foul trouble. But the concern is that this is one of the lowest totals on the slate. So is there going to be, and I don't believe that's going to be a blowout until maybe like 5 minutes left where they just maybe press the gas and just finish it up and maybe try to cover. But I don't think it's going to be a full cover on the 11 points. I would even maybe potentially bet on New Orleans just because there's just this thing where guys need to prove it a little bit. And yeah, they may get dominated by Embiid, but there's a chance to keep it close because it's not exactly that Philly is sitting there with a perfect unparalleled lineup either.
Won't shock anybody, but with this Denver news, that game has come off the board for the moment anyway. So anyone who maybe, I don't know, wanted to swoop in when it was an 8-point game, you had that opportunity, and now it's off. We'll see what happens when it comes back, what it looks like. But a couple of games that are, I guess, relative blowout projections anyway. That Pelicans game we were talking about in Philadelphia with the Sixers by 11 right now. We'll see, obviously, if Joel Embiid goes ham tonight or Tobias Harris, one of the guys we were talking about earlier on the show, who seems like someone in a real good spot. Celtics, we haven't even, I don't think, mentioned Boston so far. 9-point favorites at home against a struggling Sacramento team, of course, with a big question mark with respect to De'Aaron Fox. Do you guys in general, in terms of, placing your bets, do you want to go near a game that you expect to be a blowout, or are you more inclined to look at the games that are obviously closer spreads at the moment?
I actually like some big favorites tonight, which is, oh man, I'm gonna have to stop again because Scottie Barnes is now downgraded to questionable for the Raptors.
The downgrade is usually trends in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of downgrade to questionable, but then everything's fine that often. But they kind of need him, so oh man, okay. Anyway, we'll just ignore that for a second.
Well, that news kind of plays into what you said earlier, like. This is potentially now really shaping up for Charlotte to be favored. And we had the moment there where Toronto was favored and you could have gotten the value on the Charlotte side.
I mean, it's still sitting there. So,
I'll tell you what, though, everybody who, is concerned about betting and they're worried about DFS tonight are thrilled that this is all happening right now. Still an hour plus away from lock. Actually have a little bit of time to process this.
Yeah. So I guess betting is more urgent, right? Because the decisions kind of need to be made now. DFS, yeah, you've got 80 minutes still. But what I was saying before, like, I think the Sixers are interesting at -11 because I think Matisse Thiebel is really relevant right now just because of who else they're missing. Mm-hmm. To Shirag's point, though, yes, I think it's not so much that the Pelicans have a lot to prove. It's that they're on a back-to-back, but the guys who played a lot of minutes last night are not actually playing. So the players who are in tonight are pretty well rested. They didn't play much last night. So the back-to-back not so relevant. And then the Sixers tend to be really cautious with Embiid down the stretch of games when they're up 15, 20 points. You see a lot of times Tobias Harris will be out there, Tyrese Maxey, and Drummond will be playing with them because they're up enough where they don't want to pull all the starters, but they don't want to put Embiid out there because Embiid is, injury risk as much as anyone, and they'll be pretty cautious with him. So Pelicans back to recover, definitely a concern, but I think laying the points with Boston is worth doing. They were -8.5. I think, do we have that? Is that one still on the board, or do we have an injury that took that one down? But I think the Celtics might be around 8.5 or 9.
It's 9 now.
9. Yep.
So the scenario we want there is De'Aaron Fox plays the line goes down to about 8 or 7.5, and then you bet the Celtics. Because it's the point I was making before about Klay Thompson, before the Will Barton news ruined all of that, is that there are players who people think are good who actually make their teams worse. And it's not because the player isn't good. I think De'Aaron Fox is okay. He's like an average player who just, does a lot. But the backups the Kings have are good. Like Tyrese Halliburton will play more minutes if Fox is out. Buddy Hield will play more minutes. Davion Mitchell will play more minutes. Like, I think all of those people are at least comparable to Fox. Halliburton, I'm very confident, is better than Fox. So any, transfer of responsibility from Fox to Halliburton is net positive for the Kings. So if we get Fox in, I think the Celtics deserve to go up to like minus 10 or 11. And we're going to see the opposite because people react to big names playing in the same way every time without really considering, the specific circumstance, who the backups are, all of that. So I think the Celtics are going to get it together. I've been a Celtics homer for the whole season, basically, even though like I've reiterated, I'm not a Celtics fan. I'm in New Jersey. I don't have any affiliation with Boston, but I just think the team's really underrated.
You technically have an affiliation with Boston working at DraftKings.
Yeah, we're living it right now.
You're hearing my my love of Boston, all things Boston, come through. But I just think the team is very, very talented, and they're going to figure it out at some point. And I just don't think the Kings are very good, and having Fox in isn't going to help them.
Some player
props.
The
Hornets are favored.
Go ahead.
And the Hornets just came back up, and now they're favored, like you called.
Well, I didn't know Scottie Barnes was going to be out or questionable or whatever, but they deserve to be minus 3 or 4 now if Barnes doesn't play. Because one of the problems with the Raptors too, they have no depth. Like this team, I mean, I think Malachi Flynn is fine, but Goran Dragic was probably supposed to be this team's starting point guard or sixth man and hasn't really played. And if you start getting Delano Banton and Yuta Watanabe and Svi Mikhailuk and guys like that playing tons of minutes, like it's not a good team. And even without Hayward, the Hornets have Cody Martin and they have Kelly Oubre. Like they have competent players. Hayward is totally replaceable on that roster because the Hornets basically have 7 guys that all can do the same thing.
Just looking at some of the player props from this game, it's obviously kind of in flux. But where would you guys be looking right now, Sharag? You can go first here on this one because we've been keeping Matt talking for a little while. If you're thinking about props from various games outside of the traditional bets surrounding money line and spread and over under and all of that, which game would you be locking in on at the moment?
Probably the one with the least amount of certainty right now, or figuring out like for example, the Raptors, all their lines are down, all the lines for the Pelicans are down, so like you're not really gaining very much in terms of like edge. So it's basically waiting for seeing what's happening with the news or taking what we have. And right now, what the game to consider, I would say, is Spurs Rockets. Like there's a potential here to find value in either the over or under side. Like I think DeJounte Murray at 21.5 is not bad in terms of his points prop. But what's really cool about DeJounte Murray is that he picks up the points, rebounds, and assists. So maybe looking at his points, rebounds, and assist prop, because that with that sitting at 39.5, yes, it's high, but he's already done that multiple times in the last week alone.
I was looking at I was just going back to Denver here. I was looking at obviously Nick Jokic's props because of what we were all saying and to some degree joking about could happen in that game. So right now his points are 26.5. That's the over under. His rebounds 13.5. His assists 8.5. Double for him, which just feels like a lock, is minus 1,100, which is interesting. Well, and then
it is. I mean, you're right. It's close to a lock. You got to lay 11-1 on him just to get a double. It makes sense. I mean, he does that almost every
and
time.
Then triple double for him is plus 185. How do you feel about that number?
It's more likely with Barton out for sure. And the other thing Barton being out does is you get less chance of a blowout because Barton's a decent player. Denver doesn't have a lot of depth. Like they're going to lose a little bit not having him there. So I don't know if plus 185 is a good number necessarily, but like it's well within reason that Jokic could do it. And then also, I mean, if he's close to the triple double, he probably is staying in. Like, he's not going to get taken out of the game with 27 points, 14 rebounds, and 9 assists. They're going to leave him in for the extra, because he can get an assist whenever he feels like it, pretty much, or at least get a guy a good look where maybe it doesn't make the shot, but they could get a few extra possessions out of him to go for it. So I don't hate that bet. Maybe it's worth talking about Jokic for MVP again before, because we do this once a week. I just think he's so deserving of it. But as far as bets that I like for tonight, I think the Lakers are still overvalued. I really like the Nets at +4. And then, especially if Patrick Beverley doesn't play, I think Portland's interesting. I think Portland is a good bet regardless against Minnesota. But if Beverley plays, it gets even better. So those teams are both getting about 3.5, 4 points. I think those home underdogs are both worth looking into.
Since you brought it up, Matt, DK Sportsbook Joker sitting at +500 to win most valuable player. He's behind Steph, Giannis, and Embiid.
To add in your triple double note really quickly, Dejounte Murray at +330.
Interesting.
It's a good matchup. I mean, there's no question about it. It's just the Spurs were missing players for a while. Like, there was a stretch where Murray was playing, but White was out. Keldon Johnson was out. Devin Vassell was out. I think those were the 3 that weren't playing. So we should expect Murray's stats to regress a bit just because all of those guys are healthy now. Like, I don't know what his baseline is I guess what I'm saying. Like, Sherrod could be right and he's still undervalued, but it also might be true that Derek White picks up more and more because, he was on a minutes limit when he first came back from being out for COVID. And he's, one of the Spurs' best players. If they're going to make the playoffs, like, he's got to be a big part of it. So I'm just not sure. Like, I don't really know how Murray's next month looks necessarily.
I do like White a lot tonight.
Rockets are a good team to be playing against.
White is projected, he's 6K, obviously. He's projected for north of 35 points tonight. So he's, great spot along with Pirtle, Murray, obviously. Murray's projected for, more than 50. He's certainly a stud, but it's this whole Spurs team. Again, if you're thinking about daily fantasy, again, getting away from betting for a second, those 3 guys, Keldon Johnson, Vassell, obviously, who Matt mentioned, you can go down to, Thaddeus Young, you can make a case for at the minimum at 3K. This is a group of guys that you can very easily roster a lot of them. It's not just the Spurs, it's the Pelicans. Those are, among others, that the value that's being created by all this injury news that we've talked about over the last half hour or so. There's just going to be a lot of, I think it's going to be very stars and scrubs tonight based on everything, the way this evening is unfolding right now, Sherrod.
Yep, I agree to that.
So, well, now let's attempt to kind of reset for anyone that's joining us late at this point in time. Sherrod, what are you still waiting on right now before lock happens or before certain games lock anyway?
Fox news is if Fox sits, like, Halliburton at 7,400 is pretty interesting, and I think I may have froze there.
No, we got you. You did for a quick little blip, but we have you.
Yeah. And then Matt mentioned Davion Mitchell. Sure, he's not. It has not shown elite upside, but like, if this game gets out a little bit out of hands for the Kings, which is very much in the range of outcomes, like, you have a chance where Mitchell can play 30 minutes, and when he gets 30 minutes, he has a chance to drop 30 fantasy points too at 4,400. There's just so many cheap options that, like, the building tonight is going to be interesting. But then keep in mind the time frame. So the Kings start 30 minutes after the main lock happens, but then we have this other kind of blip, and then it goes to the 10 o'clock games. And in that 10 o'clock game, you're watching out for that Beverly news. So I think and with the Spurs having the top total, there's so much to consider.
I just refreshed the ownership projections as things stand right now. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 of the top 8 projected owned players all come from the Pelicans or Spurs. So it's just that kind of night. It's picking the right ones, and Matt, hoping you, I don't know about fade the right ones, but at least that you don't miss out on playing the right ones. It's kind of like last night where we saw a lot of different guys go off for certain teams. We could see the same thing here tonight.
Yeah, just a quick note. It seems like Nick Claxton is going to be playing, so that's a decent size boost for the Nets, and just in terms of betting with their chances against the Lakers. But for DFS, yeah, I think like this Beverly news is not going to be accounted for properly because it's going to be so much after all these other games lock, like Sherrod was saying. Most of the value plays well, I guess the Spurs are at 8, but there's a ton of them that are at 7. But the thing I really like with Minnesota is that Beverly costs the same as Noel and Beasley. So I think you can almost justify slotting Beverly into every lineup you make, or a lot of them. It doesn't have to be, I don't want to be that extreme about it. But if you play Beverly, he's a good value. I mean, when he's active, you have Patrick Beverly playing how many minutes? Like 30 plus a game at $4,300. It's a good matchup against Portland. Like, he's a very strong play at that price. And then if he doesn't play, you have two choices actually to pivot to. Jalen Noel and Malik Beasley both cost about the same amount. So you can swap to either of them. And I think like Noel is probably the safer option because I think he's more in the rotation normally. Beasley's the guy who's been starting when Beverly doesn't play. So any of those three guards, given the right circumstance, is like, it's worth planning that out, because with all of this New Orleans stuff and all this San Antonio stuff, and assuming that we don't get the Wolves news before 8 p.m., let's say Beverly's ruled out at 9, like, we're going to have very low ownership on Noel and Beasley because people will, everyone's lineups will have been locked, like full of players locked. Like, you won't really have guys to use. There's really no one on Dallas or Golden State that's going to be especially popular. And there's no one on Minnesota or Portland that's going to be especially popular. So like, no one, I think most people will have lineups that only include players that play 8 p.m. or earlier. And if you, I mean, it's more reason to consider guys like Nurkic and Towns and Luka and maybe Steph, because you get yourself more flexibility late. And then Klay Thompson also can get ruled out. And it's a pretty decent bump for Jordan Poole. I mean, he's $5,700. So like, the upside isn't huge for that price. But you can take a shot at a Warriors player at that point. Like, if you fade Jose Alvarado, let's say, and you wind up playing Damian Lee because Klay's out and Damian Lee's playing, you know, half the game, maybe a little more, that's a pretty reasonable value play too. Like, I don't think you have to play these early guys, even though there's a lot of good ones. But there are a lot of good ones. And if the news doesn't break right late, like, you're kind of stuck in the Warriors situation. Minnesota, though, you can play Beverly. I think.
Question for you there, Matt. If, let's say, for example, we are seeing that there's an opportunity here where people are stacking maybe Towns or Luka or something in terms of like expensive guys, and maybe another one like minorly mid-range guy. If Alvarado or the Pelicans guys end up busting, what would a good strategy be to kind of leverage that? Because we kind of already have that result by around 10 o'clock.
Yeah, it's hard because you're likely not saving a lot of spots from the last two games. Like, I'm talking about saving maybe 2 slots, like a cheaper guy and a more expensive guy.
Yeah.
Because to your point, like, you do want to play more like higher projecting, but also higher owned players late if everyone's lineups are dead early. Right? Like, if you're ahead of the field because they all play, like, let's say everyone plays Nickeil Alexander-Walker and he turns his ankle in the first quarter and you didn't play him. You can do whatever you want with the rest of your lineup now. Like, you're not competing with nearly as many people now because, you know, so many lineups are burned by that situation. So it is definitely worth keeping an eye on that kind of thing. But at the same time, like, I don't know that there's an obvious player from the late games to specifically go after. But let's say, like, we know at 8 o'clock, like, I'll give, you know, the worst case scenario for everybody. The Pelicans players all get injured, right? Like, all the chalk ones.
Everybody.
And now it's 7:45 and you're like, yeah, but the Spurs are chalk. Like, I'd rather just play some Blazers who are less like, no, just play the Spurs then. Like, if you faded all the Pelicans and the game got rained out, however that might work in basketball, like, the Pelicans players are all going to get 0. Just pick your Spurs then, because you don't have to worry about ownership anymore. So to that point, yeah, I totally agree. It's just going to be difficult with these 10 o'clock games.
I just can't fathom. I'm not sitting here saying like, oh, you have to play 4 Pelicans or something like that, you know, and I get that it's scary with this game starting at 7 o'clock. I fully understand that, you know, and not leaving things to leaving news to break throughout the night. I mean, you're locked in, your lineup is basically done, but I'd be shocked, guys, if we're looking at this thing at the very end of the night at whatever time, you know, 12:30, 1 a.m. and we see that the winning lineup doesn't have 1 or 2 Pelicans in there. I would be so surprised.
So to that point, like I mentioned negative correlation before, that's a reason not to play 2 of the same guys who kind of do the same thing. And it's also a reason not to play 0, because the odds of both Hayes and Hernan Gomez having bad games are are pretty low.
Sure.
Yeah.
One guy gets in foul trouble, the other one is likely going to smash. We don't know which it's going to be, but like, I think the best strategy is to play one of the guards on New Orleans between Alexander Walker and Alvarado and play one of the bigs. So playing all four seems wrong to me, even though it's going to look better because one, it's highly owned. And two, you have players who are detracting from each other with Alexander Walker and Alvarado as one pair and Hayes and Hernangomez as the other pair. So you just pick one from each pair and then save some spots for more contrarian guys after. So I'm certainly not suggesting to play 0 Pelicans. I think that's a little nuts, honestly. So you're definitely right. Like we're going to see, I mean, my guess is the winning lineup will have two of these guys. I just don't know. I just don't know which two it's going to be.
No, it'll be Herbert Jones. Herbert Jones and just some other guy. We'll find out. Sherrod will be laughing all the way to the bank. All right, it's about time for us to get out of here because there's a Madden Sim coming your way in just a few minutes here on the DraftKings YouTube and Twitch channels, obviously. We do appreciate everyone hanging out with us, including, of course, producer Eamon and undercover boss Tom. It's been fun. I mean, I thought we'd maybe go game by game, but with the way the injury news and everything was coming out rapid fire, we still have not definitively locked everything in for tonight. So stay tuned. Keep an eye, obviously, on DK Live as news breaks. It'll come out for you as well. Matt, Chirag, I'm Adam. We thank you for being here with us, guys. Thank you, as always. Enjoy. Good luck with your lineups, and we'll do it again later in the week.